Hello, my dear friends. They locked their daughters in irons, sewed their chastity back into surgical thread, and called every female desire a disease that needed to be cured. The Victorian era was more than just long skirts, afternoon tea, and poetry. It was a society where desire was monitored, repressed, and twisted into bizarre and creepy rules. Vibrators were used as drugs, see-through nightgowns were considered moral, and even love letters could land you in court. Tonight, let's open the door to the most bizarre sexual secrets of the Victorian era. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you ever thought that Victorian marriage was about romance, candlelight, and long walks through foggy gardens, you might want to pause before imagining what actually happened in the drawing rooms and medical offices of that era. Beneath the lace gloves and embroidered corsets was a level of sexual surveillance that makes modern dating look lawless in comparison. In Victorian Britain, virginity was not simply valued, it was inspected, certified, and in some cases, fabricated. A young woman's worth, her future, and her ability to marry often hinged on one invisible membrane. The idea that a bride must be a virgin was not new. But in Victorian society, that idea became an obsession wrapped in medical language, family reputation, and male entitlement. It wasn't just about honour anymore, it was about evidence. For some families, especially in the upper and middle classes, love letters and social standing were not enough. They wanted medical proof. And doctors, more than happy to comply, turned into unofficial inspectors of morality. A young girl could be asked, often without her informed consent, to undergo an examination to determine whether she was intact. These so-called virginity checks were usually arranged by the parents, not the fiancé. It was a transaction between families, cloaked in paternal concern but driven by social anxiety. The examination was clinical in name only. In practice, it was intrusive and humiliating. It's one thing to demand purity from your daughter, but quite another to outsource that demand to a man with a stethoscope and a moral superiority complex. The idea that virginity could be determined visually or physically was, even then, scientifically flimsy. But that did not matter. What mattered was the illusion of certainty. Families believed in the hymen the way they believed in inheritance, something to be guarded, confirmed, and passed on unbroken. In a society where a woman's sexual history was treated as a public ledger, any uncertainty became a threat. That threat had to be neutralized, and the tools were not only medical, but theatrical. Some young women, under enormous pressure, resorted to methods that were neither honest nor safe. Artificial hymens made of rubber or animal membrane began to circulate through certain discrete networks. These devices, sometimes called virginity restorers, were inserted before the wedding night and designed to produce a small amount of blood. The goal was simple. A stain on the bedsheet was worth more than a genuine history. Modern ideas of trust and communication look almost quaint when compared to the Victorian reliance on bodily stagecraft. These rubber implants were difficult to obtain and often painful to use, but they became a desperate lifeline for women who had lost their virginity outside of marriage, whether by choice or coercion. For them, deception was not about seduction. It was about survival. A single mark of suspicion could derail a wedding, ruin a family, or cast a woman into lifelong disgrace. The artificial hymen was a lie wrapped in latex, but it was also a shield. In a world obsessed with control, women learned to fake submission in order to keep what little freedom they had. The emphasis on bleeding during the wedding night turned a private moment into a public trial. The expectation was that the bedsheet would show proof of virginity, and that this proof could be examined by the husband or even, In rare cases, the family. Some households preserved the stained cloth as a sign of virtue fulfilled. Others whispered behind closed doors about whether no such stain appeared. For women, this created a paradoxical terror to be intimate while being watched, and to perform authenticity without room for error. What's particularly chilling is how few people questioned the logic. Newspapers published advice on how to preserve maidenhood. Religious leaders warned that even touching oneself could destroy purity. Doctors warned about riding horses or climbing stairs. The hymen was treated like a fragile relic, and its preservation became a symbol of an entire family's reputation. That such an anatomical feature could carry the weight of so many expectations is both absurd and cruel. Looking at it from today's perspective, we might laugh at the idea of a virginity certificate, but we still live in a world where women's bodies are expected to tell the truth, even when silence would be kinder. The language may have changed, but the pressure hasn't disappeared. Now it hides behind different terms, different rituals, and different judgments. Some women, of course, escaped these expectations, but many did not. Especially in respectable families, the body of the daughter was not hers to govern. It belonged to her future husband, to her father's pride, and to the whispers of society. The only time it became hers was in secret, and even then, only briefly. In some cases, girls would attempt to damage or rupture their hymens on purpose before marriage, hoping to avoid suspicion later. The logic was cruel, but it was logical within the system. To understand Victorian sexual morality, you have to accept its contradictions. The era preached modesty but demanded exposure. It glorified innocence but made it a burden. It valued chastity but created a black market for illusions. The women caught in this web knew better than anyone that their purity was less about them and more about those who claimed ownership of it. In this world, silence was safety, curiosity was punished, and mistakes were permanent. Girls grew up under the eyes of mothers who remembered their wedding nights, and fathers who acted as if biology was a moral compass. What strikes me most is how many women must have lived in fear of a single moment, a single night, a single question they could not answer without shame. That kind of fear does not disappear easily. It lingers in the wallpaper, the diaries, and the rules no one dares write down anymore. As the sun set on another well-mannered dinner, and the parlour filled with music and propriety, a young bride might sit upstairs in her chamber, wearing lace and pearls, but thinking only of blood. She was not just a wife-to-be, she was a test, a symbol, a container of expectations. In the next part, we'll see how this obsession with purity twisted further into a world where female desire itself was not just discouraged, but medically denied. Victorian women were not only expected to be pure, they were expected to feel nothing at all. While the obsession with virginity dictated how a woman should arrive at marriage, the expectations did not end at the altar. They intensified. Once a woman became a wife, a new form of control took over. Her purity was no longer measured by whether she had been touched. It was now judged by how she reacted. In Victorian society, female desire was not just discouraged, it was erased, denied, and redefined as pathology. A respectable woman was not supposed to enjoy sex. She was expected to endure it. The ideal wife was quiet, modest, and submissive in every realm, but especially in the bedroom. Expressing any kind of sexual enthusiasm could call her decency into question. Even smiling too much or blushing in front of men could be seen as a warning sign. And if she showed too much interest in intimacy with her husband, that interest could be used against her. Passion, for Victorian women, was not a virtue. It was a flaw to be corrected. This belief shaped the most personal parts of a woman's life. Marital intercourse, instead of being a shared connection, was treated like a duty, a chore to be performed for reproduction or male relief. A wife might lie still, eyes closed, hands folded over her stomach, trying not to react. That was the model of grace. To flinch was excusable. To moan was shameful. It was the only time in history when breathing heavily during intimacy could be considered a character defect. There was no safe space for female sexuality to develop. Girls were not taught about their bodies beyond the need to stay covered and quiet. Husbands, raised in the same restrictive culture, often expected emotional absence as a sign of virtue. For some men, any indication that their wives might want more was seen as suspicious. Where did she learn to feel that who gave her permission to enjoy this? Such thoughts fed into a vicious cycle where curiosity became evidence and silence became safety. Medical authorities did little to help. They often made things worse. The emerging field of gynecology in the 19th century treated female pleasure as a medical problem. If a woman showed signs of arousal, or simply expressed dissatisfaction with her marital life, she could be diagnosed with a range of invented conditions. The most famous among them was hysteria. This vague and ever-expanding label was used to explain everything from irritability to insomnia to tearfulness. But in many cases, it was simply a response to being trapped. The so-called treatment for hysteria involved what doctors described as pelvic massage. This was a procedure where the physician would stimulate the patient's genitals by hand until she experienced what they coyly called paroxysm. These were, quite clearly, orgasms, but neither the doctors nor the patients were allowed to call them that. The process was considered medical, not sexual, even though the outcome said otherwise. It's hard to decide what's more absurd, the fact that women needed a prescription to feel pleasure, or the fact that the doctors didn't even realise what they were doing. For many women, these appointments were the only way to access any kind of sexual release. The doctor's office became the only place where their bodies could respond freely, even if the context was clinical and emotionally detached. Some women returned regularly for treatment, and some doctors began to complain about how time-consuming the sessions were. This problem led to the invention of a machine, the vibrator. Its original purpose was not pleasure, but efficiency. It was a labour-saving device for physicians, not a toy for patients. This kind of medical gaslighting worked hand in hand with cultural suppression. Literature, sermons, etiquette manuals, and even fashion reinforced the idea that women were naturally less sexual than men. It wasn't just a preference, it was presented as science. Books argued that the female body was designed for maternity, not passion. That a woman who felt a strong desire was either ill, immoral, or secretly male in temperament. The image of the perfect wife was one who felt nothing and smiled politely while doing so. Today, the same behaviours that once labelled a woman as deviant are celebrated in therapy offices and relationship advice columns. The modern emphasis on mutual pleasure would have seemed deeply radical in the Victorian drawing room. Women who enjoyed sex were, in many ways, punished by invisibility. They could not speak of it, seek it, or shape it. And for those who did, even within marriage, there was no safe place to land. They were cast out of polite company, or else quietly reconditioned under the guise of treatment. There is something especially cruel about teaching a person to be ashamed of their own instincts. Victorian society taught women to fear their feelings, to doubt their bodies, and to turn inward at the moment they most needed connection. What started as modesty turned into silence, and silence turned into illness. And when the illness was finally named, the cure was another form of control. Not all women accepted this fate passively. Diaries from the period revealed glimpses of resistance. Some wrote of longing, confusion, or frustration, tucked between recipes and household budgets. Others found ways to explore their bodies privately, though never without guilt. A few brave voices published novels and essays under male pseudonyms, describing emotional hunger in veiled language. These fragments suggest that the fire was never truly gone. It was only buried. What stays with me is how deeply the system depended on pretense. Everyone knew, at some level, that women had desires, but pretending they didn't was easier than rewriting the rules, so the rules remained. And the women disappeared into them, little by little, until they no longer recognized their reflections in the mirror of culture. In the evening light of the parlour, as husbands read the paper and wives poured tea, 1,000 stories went untold. A woman could wear silk, attend church, raise children, and still feel invisible inside her skin. Her pleasure did not belong to her, her body did not belong to her, and her silence was mistaken for peace. In the next part, we'll examine how this silence turned into something even more sinister. The fear of female pleasure led to a war against solitary acts, where even the most private moments were treated as criminal threats to health, morality, and the soul. What began as a denial of female pleasure did not stop with women's desires in the bedroom. It extended into every corner of bodily control, including the most private acts that occurred without any partner at all. In the Victorian imagination, there was perhaps no greater threat to morality, health, and the future of the nation than the lone hand of a child or adolescent under the blanket. Masturbation, once viewed by some ancient cultures as harmless or even beneficial, became a full-blown medical panic in the 19th century. Victorian doctors, preachers, educators, and parents united in a campaign to eradicate what they considered a silent epidemic. The mere act of touching oneself was not just frowned upon, it was demonized. Medical manuals warned that masturbation would lead to a cascading collapse of the body and mind. Blindness was the most infamous claim. But the list of alleged consequences extended far beyond that: seizures, insanity, heart failure, spinal deformity, memory loss, and moral degradation. These beliefs weren't just whispered between adults. They were printed in books, delivered from pulpits, and taught to children in schoolrooms. Illustrations showed hunched-over boys turning into madmen. Girls who indulged were described as future prostitutes or invalids. The warnings were not symbolic. They were explicit, and they instilled deep fear. A child who engaged in what we now consider a normal part of development could be told that they were destroying their own soul. In more extreme households, this panic took physical form. Parents began to search for ways to stop their children from touching themselves at night. Some resorted to sewing the sleeves of nightgowns shut so the hands could not move freely. Others tied their hands to bedposts or used sleeping gloves that were stiff and uncomfortable. The goal was to create barriers between the body and itself. The Victorian solution to self-discovery was to wrap it in linen, bind it in shame, and hope the urge went away. For boys, metal rings with inward-facing spikes were sometimes placed around the penis. These devices, often called anti-masturbation rings, were designed to inflict pain if arousal occurred. More elaborate contraptions involved belts with locks, sometimes made of leather and reinforced with metal plates. These were fitted to prevent access entirely. Girls were not spared either. Some wore chastity devices resembling small cages that covered the pelvic area. These tools were not sold in curiosity shops. They were marketed through medical catalogues, prescribed by doctors, and ordered by well-meaning but terrified parents. Looking at this from a modern perspective, it's like trying to stop a sneeze by sewing someone's nostrils shut. The logic was crude, the technology was cruel, and the cost was emotional devastation. Children grew up thinking their bodies were dangerous, that their instincts were dirty, that their nighttime thoughts were proof of corruption. Some doctors made careers out of treating the so-called effects of masturbation. Clinics for nervous disorders often treated patients who had confessed to self-touching. The treatments varied from cold baths to dietary restrictions to electric shock therapy. Some even prescribed circumcision, not for medical or religious reasons, but as a form of deterrent. For girls, the removal of the clitoris was sometimes recommended. These acts were justified as therapeutic, but they were rooted in punishment. The most disturbing part of all this is that these beliefs were often backed by science as it existed at the time. Respected medical journals published articles claiming that semen loss weakened the body and led to early death. That female stimulation caused uterine displacement. That repeated self-abuse would damage the nervous system. These ideas were not challenged easily because they came from authority, and when authority is afraid, the body becomes its battlefield. There was also a class element to the panic. In wealthier families, the shame was often medicalized. In poorer families, it was moralized and punished more directly. But in both cases, the outcome was the same. Children learned early that their bodies were not theirs to explore. Any step toward autonomy was blocked, whether by fear, fabric, or steel. What stays with me is how deeply society wanted to separate people from the parts of themselves that felt pleasure. Religious institutions played their part too. Sermons about purity frequently included warnings about private sin, confessionals filled with tales of the young guilt. Mothers prayed over their children's beds. Fathers spoke of honour and discipline, but rarely of understanding. The message was repeated so often that it became internalized. Many adults carried this shame into their marriages, into their parenting, and even into their final years, in quieter homes, where the tools of punishment were absent. The silence could be just as powerful. A child who asks about their body might be met with scolding or stone-faced disapproval. Some learned to hide, others stopped asking, and that silence became generational, passed down like silverware, but far heavier to carry. There were, however, some voices of resistance, even within the period. A few progressive doctors began to challenge the claims linking masturbation to madness. They argued that the damage came not from the act itself, but from the guilt forced upon it. These opinions were often dismissed as radical, but they planted the seeds for future change. Later in the century, sexual reformers would begin to push back harder, but for much of the Victorian era, the fear remained firmly in place. Today, we live in a time when self-knowledge is considered healthy, and education about the body is encouraged in many places. But the shadow of that era lingers. In some communities, the shame still exists. In others, the conversation remains taboo. What the Victorians created was not just a moment of fear. It was a legacy of silence that continues to shape how people relate to themselves. As night fell over the manicured lawns and gaslit bedrooms of Victorian England, a young boy might lie in bed with his hands trapped in stitched sleeves. A girl might shift uncomfortably under a stiff metal plate. Neither one of them knew that what they felt was natural. They only knew that it was forbidden. In the next part, we will explore how the medical system itself became entangled in this shame. When doctors offered not healing but devices, when hands were replaced by machines, and when a woman's pleasure was still treated as an illness, just delivered more efficiently. By the time masturbation had been criminalised and repressed in Victorian homes, the medical world had already found a loophole. It did not resemble liberation. It looked, at first glance, like treatment, and it came in the form of a strange mechanical device that buzzed, hummed, and promised to restore a woman's emotional balance. The vibrator, a tool now associated with autonomy and pleasure, was born in the backrooms of clinics under the name of medicine. The idea began with hysteria, a term used broadly to diagnose any behaviour that deviated from the ideal image of a quiet, obedient Victorian woman. If a wife cried too often, she had hysteria. If she was restless, unhappy, bored, angry, aroused, or even just unusually talkative, the diagnosis fit. Hysteria had no clear symptoms and no biological marker, but it was frequently cited as the most common condition among women, and like any condition, it needed a cure. The solution, according to the doctors of the time, was what they called pelvic massage. A physician would stimulate a woman's genitals manually until she reached what they referred to as paroxysm. The term avoided any association with sexuality, but the outcome was undeniably an orgasm. Imagine an era where medical professionals gave women orgasms without ever admitting that's what they were doing. They truly believed they were relieving pressure in the uterus, calming the nervous system, or correcting an imbalance. These procedures were often done without privacy, sometimes in doctors' offices that also served male patients. There was no emotional context, no discussion of desire or connection. It was clinical, detached, and mechanical. Yet, for many women, It was the only way they experienced sexual release. Some even developed a preference for certain physicians and returned regularly for treatment. The rising demand placed a heavy burden on doctors, who soon began to complain about how long the procedures took. That burden gave rise to innovation. To save time and effort, inventors designed the first electromechanical vibrator in the late 19th century. Powered by batteries or foot pedals, these devices allowed for faster, more consistent stimulation. They were marketed not as sexual objects, but as health appliances. Vibrators were advertised in women's magazines, listed in medical catalogues, and displayed in storefronts under the label of therapeutic instruments. Some looked like sewing machines, others resembled hairdryers. Their true purpose was hidden in plain sight. It's as if the entire country agreed to keep a secret, even from itself. No one dared say what these machines really did, but everyone seemed to understand. Housewives used them in parlours, bathrooms, or bedrooms under the pretense of managing nerves or headaches. The devices were labelled massagers or tonic vibrators. Doctors encouraged their use at home, and some even offered demonstrations. Meanwhile, society clung to the illusion that sexuality remained unspoken and untouched. This strange arrangement revealed the hypocrisy at the heart of Victorian sexual repression. The same society that banned open discussion of female desire had, through its convoluted logic, made pleasure part of medical routine. A woman could not speak of arousal, but she could book an appointment to treat her hysteria. She could not discuss her needs with her husband, but she could press a machine to her pelvis each evening without raising questions. It was repression by redirection. The vibrator became, unintentionally, a symbol of contradiction. It represented the collision between control and curiosity, silence and sensation. It existed because society refused to admit that women had bodies capable of pleasure. And it persisted because women found ways to use it anyway. What fascinates me most is how medical denial became a kind of accidental liberation, even if no one was willing to say it out loud. For those who did question the practice, there was little space for discussion. Critics were dismissed as immoral or unserious. Women who spoke too openly were labelled indecent. The language of the time was carefully coded to avoid direct acknowledgement. Medical texts described the process in vague anatomical terms. Advertisements used words like soothing, invigorating, or restorative. Even among users, the real reason for the device was often never spoken aloud. It was simply known. By the early 20th century, vibrators had become widespread in middle-class households. Some were passed between generations, treated like family heirlooms. Their popularity eventually attracted the attention of those outside the medical world. When they began appearing in early erotic films, the illusion collapsed. Suddenly, these therapeutic devices could no longer hide behind health claims. Doctors began to distance themselves from the practice, and the vibrator was reclassified, not as a medical tool, but as a private item. Its exile from the doctor's office marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The irony is hard to ignore. A device born from repression became one of the first widely available tools of female sexual agency. Yet for decades, its users were never allowed to say what it was really for. Compared to today, where entire industries market self-pleasure openly, the Victorian approach looks like an elaborate charade staged in corsets and candlelight. But that charade mattered. It provided cover. And in a world that punished honesty, cover was survival. The vibrator's history is more than a footnote. It is a window into how society policed the body while still feeding its needs. It shows how control often produces the very thing it fears. Victorian authorities wanted to suppress desire. Instead, they automated it. They denied women a voice, but gave them a hum. And in that quiet vibration, some women heard something they had never heard before their bodies, speaking without shame. Even now, the shadow of that silence lingers. Some people still feel discomfort discussing these devices, as if pleasure must still be justified by pain or diagnosis. but history remembers, and it reminds us that repression does not always erase. Sometimes it reappears in the oddest forms: a brass machine on a parlour shelf, a catalogue page tucked into a drawer, a quiet buzz behind a locked door. As the gaslights dimmed in another parlour, and a woman drew the curtains in her solitary room, the hush of propriety was interrupted by something new. It did not come with ceremony or shame. It came with a quiet pulse, disguised as medicine, but felt as something far more personal. In the next part, we will return to the strange world of hysteria itself, not just the devices used to treat it, but the stories told to explain it, stories about wandering wombs, emotional collapse, and how a woman's soul was thought to reside in her uterus. Long before machines hummed in quiet bedrooms and medical catalogues offered solutions to unspoken desires, the diagnosis that made it all possible had already taken root. Hysteria, in Victorian society, was not just a medical term. It was a cultural explanation for everything that made men uncomfortable. A woman cried too often. Hysteria. She resisted her husband's authority. Hysteria. She wanted something no one would name. Still hysteria. It became the umbrella under which all disobedience, emotion, and sexuality could be hidden and dismissed. The word itself came from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. That origin shaped everything. Victorian doctors believed that the uterus had a will of its own. They described it as a wandering organ, capable of floating to the lungs, pressing on the heart, or drifting toward the brain. This so-called migration explained every symptom they could not understand. Fainting, insomnia, irritability, melancholy, even coughing. If a woman had it, her womb was probably to blame. It sounds absurd now, but at the time, it passed for science. Elite physicians taught these ideas in universities. Popular health manuals reinforced them, and ordinary people absorbed them without question. The female body was framed as unstable by nature, always on the brink of collapse, and requiring constant management. A man's melancholy might earn him poetry. A woman would earn her bed rest and enemas. It's hard not to laugh at the idea of a uterus floating through the body like a balloon. But that fantasy controlled real lives. It gave doctors the power to prescribe whatever they saw fit. And what they saw fit was often humiliating. Women were told to stay indoors, to lie still in darkened rooms, to avoid reading, to stop asking questions. The less they moved, the less trouble they were thought to cause. In some cases, they were even denied conversation for weeks at a time. The treatments prescribed for hysteria were as bizarre as the diagnosis itself. Rescues were popular, involving weeks of isolation, bland diets, and absolute inactivity. Women were not allowed to sit up, speak freely, or even feed themselves. The goal was to break their spirits quietly, under the banner of healing. Some were sent to seaside retreats or spa hospitals. Others stayed in their bedrooms with curtains drawn and minds unravelling. Then came the physical treatments: colonic purges, bloodletting, ice baths, and genital massage were all part of the hysteria toolkit. One method involved flushing the uterus with cold water, inserted through a long metal tube. Another involved electric stimulation applied to the thighs and lower abdomen. But most infamous was the pelvic massage, conducted with the physician's hands or, later, with the help of vibrators. These procedures were performed with no emotional context, no acknowledgement of pleasure, and often no consent. The strangest part is that the doctors genuinely believed they were doing something noble. They thought they were taming wild energy, calming female nerves, and restoring social balance. In truth, they were just channeling pleasure through a back door labelled treatment. Women came away relaxed, sometimes smiling, and often eager to return. But no one called it what it was. To name it would be to admit that female sexuality existed and that it had needs. The power of hysteria as a diagnosis was not in its accuracy. but in its convenience, it was the perfect tool for silencing dissent. A woman who challenged her husband could be labelled hysterical. So could a daughter who resisted marriage, a widow who enjoyed life too much, a nun who fasted excessively, a wife who asked for affection. All could be swept under the same diagnosis, placed in the same rooms, and offered the same silencing procedures. Compared to modern therapy, which seeks to understand, the Victorian model sought to erase. Emotions were treated as infections, desires as fevers, grief as a hormonal malfunction. The inner life of a woman was not considered real unless it could be measured, corrected, or soothed with a machine, and the more a woman resisted, the more her resistance confirmed the diagnosis. It was a trap, and it closed silently around her. Not every woman accepted this fate passively. Some kept diaries that reveal their awareness of the game. They played along to be left alone. Others found ways to manipulate the system, feigning symptoms to escape other forms of control. A few turned the language of hysteria against itself, publishing essays and poems under male names, using the diagnosis as a metaphor. These were rare acts of defiance in a culture that demanded compliance not with whips, but with whispers. The social reach of hysteria extended beyond the clinic. It became a theme in novels, a device in plays, and a joke among men. Satirical cartoons showed women swooning in corsets or crying over novels, always too fragile for the real world. These images masked the truth that many women lived in quiet desperation, their lives shaped by diagnoses they could never disprove. Even today, echoes of hysteria remain. Women's emotions are still more likely to be pathologized, dismissed, or treated as exaggerations. What strikes me most is how easily science can be twisted into obedience when it serves social fear. The doctors were not villains in their minds. They were protectors of order, but the order they protected came at the cost of female autonomy, and the legacy of that protection is still visible, in silence, in shame, in the inherited fear of being too much. As another evening passed behind thick drapes and heavy furniture, a woman might lie still in a padded room, her fingers folded neatly on her stomach. She had been told to rest, to be good, to be quiet. A nurse checked her pulse. A doctor scheduled her next massage. No one asked how she felt, only whether she had improved. In the next part, we will leave the clinic and enter the hidden corners of Victorian streets and studios, where another kind of desire took form, captured not in diagnosis, but in photographs, nude portraits sold behind curtains, female bodies draped in silk and myth, and a market of fantasy dressed up as anatomy. By day, Victorian England displayed itself as a nation of propriety. Manners were precise, gestures were minimal, and decency was draped in layers of fabric and ritual. Women walked with eyes lowered and hands clasped. Men spoke in measured tones, quoting scripture or science. But under this surface of order, another world existed, one not governed by etiquette, but by curiosity. It lived in shadowed storefronts, whispered invitations, and images that could never be shown in daylight. That world was made of photographs. Photography arrived in Britain with the promise of realism and modernity. At first, it served respectable purposes: family portraits, royal commissions, landscapes to document the empire. But soon, the same lens that captured a child's birthday began capturing something else entirely: bodies, poses, skin, and not for anatomy textbooks or sculpture studies alone. A new market emerged, discreet but growing. Photographs of nude women, printed in sepia or silver, began to circulate through underground shops and private collections. These were not sold openly. The studios that produced them operated quietly, often behind curtain partitions or false business names. Entry came by reference only. A gentleman might arrive for a portrait and be offered, behind closed doors, a different kind of portfolio. Inside were images of women posed in classical scenes, draped in gauze, perched on imitation rocks, lit to suggest a mood rather than expose detail. The body was on full display, but the names were not. The women became muses, never mothers. It takes a particular kind of hypocrisy to condemn the female form in public while secretly collecting it in print. That hypocrisy defined an entire class of buyers. Many claimed the photographs were for education. They called them studies in posture or light. Others said they were necessary for artists to perfect their technique. But the truth was visible in the number of copies sold and the variety of poses produced. This was not art alone. It was desire, filtered through respectability. To mask the intent, the women in the photos were rarely labelled as people. They were given titles like Flora at Rest or Spring Awakening. Some were described as goddesses or mythical beings. A crown of leaves or a sheer veil could turn any woman into an acceptable subject. The viewer was not supposed to imagine her hunger or fear, only her form, her usefulness in fantasy. Her body is still life. The models were often women who had few choices. Actresses are out of work, servants dismissed for impropriety, prostitutes seeking safer pay. Some were promised discretion, though it was rarely honoured. Others posed only once and disappeared. Their images lived on, traded hand to hand like relics from a hidden religion. What fascinates me is how these women, stripped of name and voice, still returned the viewer's gaze. Not with seduction, not with shame, but with the fact of their presence. Compared to today, when images are made in seconds and shared in millions, the process then was deliberate and intimate. A single photograph required time, stillness, chemicals, and calculation. The result was not accidental, it was chosen, and it often lived in drawers, tucked inside hollowed-out books or behind false panels in wardrobes. Husbands might keep them beneath cufflinks. Doctors might shelve them beside journals. No one spoke of them, but no one let them go. One of the more inventive justifications for these images was their supposed anatomical value. Collections of nude photos labelled as medical studies or art references were bound and distributed to artists and physicians. These sets included dozens of photos of the same woman, standing, kneeling, reclining, reaching upward, or leaning forward. Captions referenced bone structure or muscle tone, but the framing was not clinical. It was deliberate, suggestive, always careful to highlight curves, not joints. These books were not sent to hospitals. They were purchased by private gentlemen. They sat in libraries between volumes of classical poetry or natural science. Guests might be shown one or two under the guise of academic interest. No one asked where the model was from. No one cared what happened to her after the session. She existed for the photograph, and the photograph existed for the illusion of control. What gave these images their power was not only the nudity, but the denial surrounding it. They were made in a society that claimed women should never be seen this way, that clothed women were sacred, that modesty defined character. Yet here they were, catalogued and traded, their bodies preserved by the same people who condemned them in public. What stayed with me is how easily rules can bend when the person breaking them has the right vocabulary. The contradiction remained unspoken. In the streets, a woman could be shamed for showing her ankle. In the studio, she could remove everything but a ribbon and still be considered tasteful if the lighting was soft and the title poetic. The rules did not change, only the setting did, and the price. Some women used the opportunity for agency, limited though it was. They negotiated higher rates, chose their poses, refused certain props. Others endured the process in silence, hoping the money would last until winter passed. There are records of women who returned to studios again and again, not just for survival, perhaps also for recognition. In a world that denied their thoughts, their images became the only form of visibility they could control, but the risk was always there. If discovered, a woman could be dismissed from employment, cut off from family, or labelled immoral. Her image could be reused without her consent. It might appear in a shop window years later, misattributed, untouched by truth. The camera offered no protection, only exposure. In today's terms, it would be like sending a private message and having it printed as a postcard. The betrayal was not technological, it was cultural. The shame was not in the pose, it was the double standard, and it remains familiar in more ways than we might admit. As another evening drew its curtains in a quiet Victorian home, a man might settle into his study, open a drawer, and lift a folder of images wrapped in linen. He would not speak of them, he would not show them to his wife, but he would keep them, not because he believed in their artistic value, but because they held what society refused to name. In the next part, we will move from the image to the ritual, to the marriage bed, where proof was demanded, emotion was unwanted, and a single night determined a woman's worth in blood. Long before the wedding night arrived, its script had already been written. The vows were recited, the ring exchanged, and the bride handed over like an heirloom. But for many Victorian women, the real test came not at the altar, but in the bedroom. That night, under candlelight and between layers of embroidered linen, she was not simply expected to consummate a marriage, she was expected to prove something, and her body would be the evidence. Victorian culture tied virtue to biology with ruthless precision. A woman's value as a wife was not based on her kindness, intelligence, or loyalty. It was based on the presence or absence of blood on the wedding sheets. The hymen was treated not just as tissue, but as testimony. If blood appeared, it confirmed innocence. If it did not, questions followed. The bedsheet became a witness, the mattress a courtroom, and the husband its judge. For many brides, the pressure was suffocating. They had been warned about this night for years, usually through vague metaphors and whispered advice. Some were told to lie still and endure. Others were encouraged to pray. Almost none were educated on what to expect physically or emotionally. It takes a cold kind of logic to turn intimacy into an interrogation, and a woman's pain into someone else's reassurance. The first night of marriage was not about connection, it was about confirmation. The morning after, families sometimes demanded proof. In certain households, the stained sheet was displayed to relatives or servants, a crude announcement of purity preserved. If the sheet remained clean, the bride was blamed. Perhaps she had been with another man. Perhaps she was frigid. Perhaps she was a liar. Almost never was it considered that bleeding might not occur, that the hymen might already have stretched or torn from exercise, riding, or nothing at all. The idea that female pleasure should be excluded from this moment was deeply ingrained. A wife was expected to submit, not enjoy. Any sign of enthusiasm was suspicious. If she relaxed or smiled, it raised questions. Where had she learned to behave that way? Whom had she practiced with? This twisted logic turned a natural human response into a cause for alarm. The safest bride was the silent one, still, wide-eyed, and preferably trembling. Some men, terrified of disappointment or scandal, sought certainty in advance. They visited brothels not for lust alone, but for reassurance. Prostitutes were asked to simulate wedding night scenarios, to pretend to be virgins, to lie back and bleed on cue. These rehearsals gave the men confidence, or at least the illusion of preparation. But it also deepened the contradiction. They sought experience for themselves, while demanding ignorance from their future wives. Compared to the shared vulnerability modern couples often aim for, the Victorian wedding night resembled a one-sided audit. One person arrived with expectations, the other with anxiety. There was no room for curiosity, no time for learning, only performance, judgment, and the quiet hope that no one would ask the wrong question at breakfast. Medical professionals contributed to the confusion. Some doctors published guides for husbands, describing what to expect and how to interpret it. These texts often included charts or diagrams, warning signs of deception, and advice on how to handle a nervous bride. The idea that the first act of married life might be painful, awkward, or even traumatic was rarely addressed. Instead, the emphasis was on the result: blood, compliance, silence. For women, this silence extended beyond the bedroom. They were not expected to discuss their feelings, their fears, or even their discomfort. If a bride wept the next day, she was told to be grateful. If she recoiled from her husband, she was advised to pray. The vocabulary of trauma did not exist. Neither did the concept of consent in the modern sense. She was now a wife. That was enough. What unsettles me most is how entire generations of women were taught that their pain was a normal part of beginning a life with someone. They were told that love came later, that pleasure was for other kinds of women, that a wife's duty was to endure in silence. The bruises on her thighs were not spoken of. The tears on her pillow are not seen. The sheets were washed and folded without comment. The ritual around blood was not confined to aristocratic homes. It filtered through every level of society, though with varying degrees of formality. In some working-class families, mothers-in-law checked the bedding. In wealthier homes, housekeepers were told to watch and report. Stories circulated in newspapers and etiquette books, reinforcing the idea that a marriage's success began with a mark on cotton. Even in households where no one checked, the expectation lingered. Women carried it like a weight on their spine. They feared what might happen if they failed this unspoken test. Some inserted items to simulate bleeding. Others confessed to sins they had not committed, convinced it was better to be punished than suspected. In every version of the story, the body became both the battleground and the scapegoat. Some husbands, despite their own experience, failed to notice or care about their hypocrisy. They demanded purity while recalling their nights in back-alley establishments. They praised chastity but mocked prudishness. They wanted wives who knew nothing but please like professionals. This double standard shaped not only expectations, but the very nature of desire itself. Those few women who did enjoy the act, who felt arousal or warmth, often learned to hide it. They turned their heads, bit their lips, stayed quiet. To react was to risk everything. A laugh could be mistaken for knowledge, a moan for guilt. In the language of the time, there was no way for a woman to say, "I want this," and still be seen as good. In today's conversations about mutual consent and emotional safety, the Victorian wedding night feels like a courtroom staged inside a bedroom. The goal was not connection, it was confirmation. The sheet was not just linen, it was judgment, doctrine, and myth, all stitched together. As the lamps dimmed and the hallways fell silent, the young bride might lie beneath the unfamiliar blankets, staring at the ceiling. Her husband is beside her. Her body is sore. Her thoughts are swirling. She had done what was asked. Whether it brought joy or pain did not matter. What mattered was the outcome, folded at the foot of the bed. In the next part, we will move deeper into the contradictions of control, where society banned passion on paper but fed it in secret, where kisses happened through keyholes, where games of innocence turned quickly into spectacles of hidden desire. Behind the velvet curtains of drawing rooms and the carefully trimmed hedges of public gardens, there existed a love that was never meant to be spoken. In Victorian England, same-sex desire was not just discouraged, it was illegal, not in the vague sense of moral disapproval, but through strict, codified law. For men, especially, expressing affection toward another man could mean the end of a career, a lifetime of exile, or imprisonment with hard labour. What was considered an act of intimacy in private became a public crime if ever uncovered. The law did not pretend to be subtle. Under statutes like the Offences Against the Person Act, same-sex activity was described as a form of gross indecency. It was placed alongside acts of violence and assault, as if to suggest that love itself could be harmful. Men accused of engaging in such relationships were arrested, tried, and often sentenced to prison. Some were sent to penal colonies abroad. Others were publicly humiliated, their names printed in newspapers, their reputations erased overnight. One of the most infamous cases was that of Oscar Wilde, a celebrated playwright and literary figure. Wilde was charged and convicted not because he harmed anyone, but because he loved men. His trial was a national spectacle. The prosecution introduced his letters and poems as evidence of criminal behaviour. The sentence was 2 years of hard labour. When Wilde emerged from prison, he was physically broken and socially destroyed. His writings continued, but his life never recovered. It takes a special cruelty to turn affection into evidence and desire into confession. Victorian society did not care about the nuance of love. It cared about order. Anything that challenged the image of the proper English gentleman was seen as dangerous, and same-sex attraction, especially among men, was framed not just as inappropriate, but as a sign of deviance, perversion, or disease. To survive, those who felt such desire had to speak in code. A hidden vocabulary developed, allowing people to recognize each other without drawing attention. One of the most fascinating of these was the language of flowers. In this silent code, a green carnation pinned to a lapel might signal same-sex interest. A red rose might mean longing. A gift of violets could suggest loyalty or sorrow. Entire conversations took place through bouquets, carefully arranged and nervously delivered. Compared to the open identities and pride parades of today, these floral whispers seem impossibly fragile. But for those who used them, they were lifelines. In a world where a wrong glance could spark an arrest, secrecy was not just a strategy, it was survival. Parties were held in private homes, invitations extended only to trusted friends. Letters were written with aliases, then burned. Love was hidden in poetry, encrypted in metaphor, and carved into tree trunks under false names. For some, these quiet efforts were not enough. They built entire worlds behind closed doors. Secret clubs, often presented as literary circles or charitable societies, became meeting places for those who lived beyond the law. In London and other cities, underground groups gathered under the guise of discussing art, theatre, or spiritualism. But behind the formalities, connections were made. Friendships became something deeper. A glance across a parlour, a touch beneath a table, a moment of shared silence. These spaces were not always safe. They were sometimes infiltrated, raided, or betrayed. Informants were paid. Letters were intercepted. Even vague rumours could lead to police scrutiny. But the clubs kept reappearing, taking new forms. Some operated inside theatre communities. Others disguised themselves as art salons. The goal was not revolution, it was refuge. For women, the situation was both simpler and more complicated. Female same-sex relationships were not criminalised in the same way, largely because lawmakers refused to believe they could exist. Queen Victoria herself reportedly dismissed the idea as nonsense. As a result, women had a slightly larger margin for emotional intimacy. They could live together, write passionate letters, even sleep in the same bed, without immediate suspicion. But if the relationship became too visible, too expressive, or too physical, it risked being pathologized. Female desire was often redirected or erased. Some women were institutionalized for unnatural attachments. Others were forced into marriage. The lack of a legal definition did not mean freedom. It meant silence. A silence filled with half-finished poems, destroyed diaries, and stories told only in code. What lingers most is how many lives were lived halfway, never fully spoken aloud. The Victorians left behind countless letters that hint at passion, but stop short of clarity. They built friendships that crossed into love, but never dared say so in writing. Their histories are made of ellipsa, of pauses, as of shadows. Despite the risks, these connections endured. Some couples managed to build lives together, cloaked in ambiguity. They travelled as companions or cousins. They shared homes and bank accounts, raised pets, and kept their love alive through ritual and repetition. Their survival required discipline, not only of emotion, but of language. They became experts in not being seen, even when everyone was watching. The danger extended beyond the law. Social exile was often more immediate than any court sentence. Families disowned, employers dismissed, churches condemned. Even among friends, a revelation could mean the end of trust. There was no safety net, no advocacy, only luck, silence, and sometimes cleverness. In private moments, love still found a way. A note slipped into a glove, a meeting at dusk by the river. A single photograph, hidden behind a painting. These fragments became enough, not because they satisfied, but because they sustained. In today's context, with laws protecting same-sex marriage in many countries and open celebration in others, the Victorian system feels like a cold, closed room. But for those who lived inside it, that room was home, and they made space within it, folding down the edges of themselves until they could breathe without being noticed. As the night closed in over London rooftops and gas lamps flickered against narrow alleys, two men might walk on opposite sides of the street, their hands brushing only in imagination. Or two women might lie awake in shared silence, each pretending the other was asleep. Love, in this world, was an unfinished sentence. In the next part, we'll step into a stranger tradition still hidden beneath the polished surface of aristocratic entertainment. Parties where kisses were stolen through a hole in a door, where masks covered more than faces, and where desire was turned into a game that everyone denied playing. After the solemnity of the wedding night and the quiet rituals of inspection, desire in Victorian England often found more playful, though no less controlled, outlets. Among the upper classes, where manners were rehearsed and every fork had its place, there still existed a hunger for thrill. This hunger did not appear in scandalous novels or dimly lit alleys alone. It crept into parlours and drawing rooms, disguised as party games. And one of the strangest among them involved nothing more than a door, a keyhole, and a carefully timed kiss. These games were not played in slums or brothels. They belonged to the social calendars of the aristocracy. Evening gatherings, filled with tea, music, and polite conversation, occasionally gave way to more curious entertainments after midnight. Among the most talked about was the so-called keyhole kiss. It began innocently enough. The host announced a game. The curtains were drawn. A door was locked between two rooms, with only a single keyhole connecting them. And then, the blindfolds were brought out. Guests, usually of both sexes and all stations within the house, were invited to participate. One person stood on each side of the door. One side was designated for the kisser, the other for the receiver. Neither knew who was on the other side. A guide, often the host or a trusted guest, would gently position the participants. The lips would meet through the tiny circular hole, soft and unseen. It was a moment of contact with no context. It takes a particularly strange mindset to design a game where anonymity becomes arousal, and guessing wrong is half the fun. But that was the point. It wasn't just about kissing. It was about uncertainty,